Hello everyone, this is Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So guys, I'm getting a little bit late to the Bernie Sanders town hall, and so I'm going to do this live. Somebody else recommended that I do it live, so I'm going to do it live. I have a video that's supposed to be at 9:30 with Cynthia McKinney. But in the time being, let's take a look at Bernie Sanders town hall live on the Iran deal. We're going in late, but nevertheless, we're going in. Let's go do it live.
And so on. In the midst of all that, he has hired as his Security Council chief John Bolton, who was, as I recall, one of the architects for the war in Iraq, lied about weapons of mass destruction, and so forth. What does that tell us?
I think it's a very interesting point. I always think of President Trump as having two voices in his head. Two voices whispering, at least two. One of them is the one you refer to, which is during the campaign, he actually argued against entanglements. He's always mentioned the $7 trillion we wasted in the Middle East. He was against, he says, maybe belatedly, but still against the war in Iraq. He said he was against intervention in Syria, against intervention in Libya. That's one voice. The other voice is a voice that says, I have to do everything Obama didn't do. I have to undo his legacy. And the voice that says, I got to be tough. I got to show that I'm prepared to fight back, that I'm the macho, and as you say, who surrounds himself with people who today are giving much more voice to that second voice, who are amplifying it. It's John Bolton, it's even Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. Both of them are on record as saying that the best way to deal with Iran's nuclear program is to change the regime. They've said, by the way, the same about North Korea. So I think there's a struggle for President Trump's soul, if I could put it that way. But right now, that latter voice, the one that is dangerous, the one that is putting us on a path to confrontation. Because let's assume tomorrow that Iran decides to respond to what the U.S. did by resuming its nuclear program. Then we're back with what Laura said. We're back to 2010. And then the voices, the John Boltons and others, could tell the president, you got to hit. You got to show the world, you got to show Iran that the U.S. is back. We got our mojo back. And then we're on that very, very dangerous path against which President Trump warned us.
Just a quick interceding on that. The reason why I've been so against HA on this, I've said HA is, still a friend of the show and everything else, but the reason I've been so against him on this, because I say what he's saying is nonsense. He's trying to protect Donald Trump, and so he completely, fundamentally misses the politics, or just doesn't understand the politics of what's taking place. That Iran deal, the reason they put through that Iran deal was to prevent a war. That was the entirety of the reason for that Iran deal. Trump taking it away takes you back to where you were. Now, he's under this belief, and some of these other Trump supporters under this belief that this is not some kind of prelude to regime change. Despite Bolton, Cotton, Pompeo, all of these people being on board for regime change, not to mention Saudi Arabia and Benjamin Netanyahu, these maniacs whisper in his ear. But, the right-wingers who don't know Trump, the lefties who are pretending to be right-wingers, they know better. Or at the very least, you can say the Trump-supporting YouTubers know better.
Does himself warned us when he was a candidate.
I'm not so sure. Well, first of all, I think with this move, President Trump has for sure put us on an escalatory path with Iran. But I'm not so sure he sees a path towards war with Iran. I do think that perhaps he sees a war outside Iran among its proxies and skirmishes happening. And maybe he's deluded enough to think that he can manage those crises and they not escalate into a full regional war. I think that's very dangerous. The other thing that I think he's done that's been so destabilizing is that he has thrown the U.S.'s full support behind Saudi Arabia. And he has stoked the fire within the Middle East rather than calm it. And it's strategically such a bad move because the U.S. traditionally has sought to play a role of a moderator or an honest broker. And by siding completely with the Saudis, we've relinquished that role. We've given up any leverage we have in actually playing a constructive role in trying to mediate that conflict. So I think that is a very short-sighted.
I'm sorry, I disagree with this woman to some degree. I don't think we've played the role of a fair mediator in the Middle East. We weren't fair in our mediations between Israel and Palestine. We had a very clear perspective in regards to who we wanted to be on their side, and we assiduously aided Israel in that particular struggle. the idea that all of this fell apart when Donald Trump took office is nonsense. We've always had this bias towards Saudi Arabia. We've always had this bias towards Israel. It's been that way, not always, but for the last 40, 50 years, it's been there. That did not fall apart when Trump took over. Trump might have been an extension of it, but it did not fall apart and go tits up purely when Trump took office. Let's keep going.
Very short-sighted approach. And the Iranians have consistently said they're ready to come to the table in regional dialogue with the Saudis, and the Saudis are not. Well, why should they? Why should MBS come to the table? He feels emboldened. He has the full support of Trump. There's no reason for him to come and negotiate and compromise in any way. So I think that's another element of the Trump approach to the Middle East and this deal that is very dangerous.
Let me ask a kind of dumb bunny question, and maybe the answer is obvious, but I'm not sure everybody knows it. As Suzanne just mentioned, we are now, and I've been in kind of high-level classified meetings where people refer to Saudi Arabia as our forever ally, our kindred spirit. Meanwhile, correct me if I'm wrong, Saudi Arabia is a despotic autocracy. We can argue about how good or fair the Iranian elections are, but they do hold elections. I'm not quite sure that the Prince of Saudi Arabia was elected to anything. He has the distinction of having purchased the most expensive house in the world, a $500 million yacht, and I guess a Leonardo da Vinci painting for $450 million, while bemoaning the suffering of the people in Gaza. Why has the policies of the United States been so steered toward Saudi Arabia and so anti-Iran, when in fact you have, as you mentioned, Suzanne, among the younger people of Iran, what most of the country is under 30 now. They're very pro-Western. They feel a lot better about the United States than the young people in Saudi Arabia. Joe, how did that happen?
I think the simple answer is money. Before the Iranian Revolution, 1979, our main client in the Middle East was Iran, was the Shah of Iran. They bought most of our weapons. They were the linchpin of our security. But since the revolution, America hasn't done much business. In fact, we're sanctioned. American companies are sanctioned from doing business with Iran. And the money has all gone to the Arab states. So Saudi Arabia is a main purchaser of U.S. military equipment. You saw the meeting in the Oval Office where Donald Trump could not help himself. He was talking about the enormous check that Saudi Arabia is about to write us for about $100 billion worth of military equipment. Of course, there's the oil deals and those arrangements, and that is true of all the Arab Gulf states. And then Saudi Arabia and the Arab states used some of those oil riches to buy influence here in the United States. It is very difficult to go to an American university and not see some Sunni Arab endowed center, or to go to a think tank in Washington and not see major contributions or halls named after some of the Saudi princes. So they buy a lot of influence in this town. They buy a lot of business in this town. But if it was simply that, it wouldn't be so bad. What's happened now is that Saudi Arabia is in a struggle for regional dominance with Iran, and they want to draw us in on their side. They want us to be actively involved militarily in pushing back the Persian Shia state, and Israel has decided to block with Saudi Arabia, and so you're setting up this major regional conflict that, as Suzanne has said, if we had just played our normal historic moderating role, we might be tamping down instead of pouring gasoline on the fires. But Rob and Laura, this is really your area, Laura.
There is a history of mutual anger, recrimination and between Iran and the United States since the revolution. I mean, what U.S. administrations, and not just this one, but going back to the Carter administration, would say is, Iran, there was a hostage crisis, support for organizations and direct acts of terrorism against the United States, support for organizations that are also hostile to Israel. On the other side of the ledger, Iran would say support for the Shah, the shooting down of an Iran civilian aircraft that killed 200, or I forget how many Iranians. civilians, support for Saddam Hussein and his use of chemical weapons against Iran during the very long Iran-Iraq war, etc.
Remind me if I'm wrong, but American outrage about the use of chemical weapons was not so loud.
Was pretty muted, I think, is a fair.
And we knew about it, by the way, meaning the cables showed that that was going to take place, and we were like, hands off, hands off. And by the way, the Iranian Revolution, the question becomes, revolution from what? What were they prior to the revolution? A Shah was put in, a strong dictator, autocratic dictator who was subservient to the United States because the CIA and British helped put that Shah and that dictator into the Iranian people themselves. I bet you he was one of the people who were going to buy the American weapons, seeing as America put his ass into that office in the first place. They rebelled and got him out of that office, in which case Iran ended up with the Ayatollah. Let's keep going. I don't want to interrupt too much. I want to let them do their thing.
Yeah, we blocked the UN Security Council resolution that was going to condemn Iraq for using chemical weapons.
So there's a history there. But the way to resolve that history is through diplomacy. You know, you could put pressure, but it's through diplomacy. The only way in which the United States and others have managed since the Iranian Revolution to change one aspect of Iranian behavior was through the nuclear deal that President Trump just shredded. That was a successful way to engage with Iran, to get them to change their behavior. We should, instead of ripping up the deal, we should be building on it, talking to Iran about parts of their policy that we resent, and they're going to put a lot on the table that they resent. Our primary embargo, our support for Saudi Arabia, our arms sales to Saudi Arabia, our policy toward the Middle East in general. But what we're doing now is simply, as Joe and others have said, we're simply fueling the flames of a conflict because we are not talking to Iran. There's no diplomacy with Iran right now, and we're in the midst of an escalatory dynamic.
I think, Senator, it's important to remember the other thing, that by withdrawing from this deal, the one channel, the one official channel we had with the Iranians is now gone. And that was the channel called the Joint Commission, where we met with the Iranians and our other partners to discuss this deal. Well, now that we're not a party to it anymore, we don't get a seat at the table. And when you think about it, we're now back to prior to the deal when we didn't have official channel with Iran. That's very dangerous because that channel has served to help, I think, stave off conflict that could have gotten out of hand. For example, when those Iranian sailors strayed into, U.S. sailors strayed into Iranian waters, it was because of the channel between the U.S. and Iran over the nuclear deal that helped to diminish that from escalating into a big deal. That's gone now, and that's very dangerous.
Okay. Review for us, a little bit about what's going on internally in Iran right now. We were talking earlier, Suzanne and others have suggested that if you are a hardliner in Iran, you are really delighted and happy with what Trump has done. On the other hand, if you are a moderator, if you're a young person, want to reach out to the world, if you want better Iran being part of the global community in a way it isn't right now, you're not very happy. So this decision has benefited the hardliners in Iran. Is that correct?
Well, ironically, it was the hardliners that began the negotiations with the U.S. During the Ahmadinejad period, but then with the advent of Rouhani and his election, that's when things really started to crystallize. So I think the group of negotiators in Iran that brought this deal to the fore, they took a major personal risk in doing this, advocating for engagement with the United States, the great Satan. So now, here they are. They were the people that put their necks on the line to become part of this deal. And, of course, the hardliners are taking great advantage of it by calling attention to the fact that they were treasonous, that they put Iran's interests in jeopardy. It's important to remember that the Iranian political system is as complex as ours. Even a bit more cutthroat, if you want to think about it. It's not, they're competing power centers, and it's a very dynamic political system. So now what I'm afraid we may see is a rise in power of the more conservative, hardline voices because this deal has not worked out for the moderates.
They are saying, we told you so. You can't trust the United
Absolutely.
States.
Even the leader himself, Khamenei, has essentially said, look, I told you that we cannot trust the United States, and what happened just now proves that.
I just say, I mean, just to build on what Suzanne said, during the negotiations, who in Iran was talking against it? Who was arguing against it? It's the hardliners in Iran, at the same time as the Trump administration says that this deal was benefiting the hardliners and benefiting the Revolutionary Guard. They were arguing against it. They didn't want to see it come to pass. So I think we could trust their judgment, that they thought this deal...
Hardliners are always emboldened by idiots. Just saying. I mean, ultimately, she's right. They put their neck on the line to put this deal forward. As think of it, the lefties in the country. We need to reach out to the United States. We need to stop this war talk and everything else. We were on a road to war. I mean, the Obama administration doing this, I consider this one of the right things that Obama did. These guys were pushing for this kind of conflict. And he hit it off at the pass using an Iran deal. If you remember, 7 countries in 5 years, or 7 countries in 10 years, whatever it was, General Wesley Clark making the point that the military plan had already been set up to go through multiple Muslim nations ending up with Iran, or multiple nations in the Middle East ending with Iran. Yeah, they're right. The hardliners are always emboldened by stuff like this. You have the lefties who stuck their neck out, got this deal through, and think about the hardliners in the United States. What does it look like if you as a lefty pushes through a plan, however you want to play, you push through that particular plan. It's political risky, you push it through, and then you find out later that a factor of the plan comes through and changes their mind on the plan and blows it away. And you're stuck there looking like an asshole because you were one of the people who were willing to stick your neck out in order to get this plan through, in order to stave off a larger conflict. It looks bad. And so yeah, the hardliners are emboldened by Trump's behavior. I would make the point that I don't think Trump cares. In fact, from the standpoint of Saudi Arabia, standpoint of Israel, and even from the standpoint of people like John Bolton, that's a good thing. They want conflict. At the very least, they want regime change. And stirring these people up is one of the ways they can do it. Let's keep going. Hardliners,
deal was not good for the hardline Iranians. It was better for the more pragmatic forces, which this decision by President Trump has just undermined.
Go ahead, Laura.
I would just add, we were talking beforehand, and we've all had these conversations in the past week about what the unintended consequences of this decision by the Trump administration might be. And the question of whether one unintended consequence is strengthening the hardliners, weakening the moderates. And I really do believe that that is a feature, not a bug, of this policy. It is much easier if you are someone who believes that this deal could not be fixed, it had to be nixed, and actually believes that the Iranian regime cannot be fixed, it must be nixed. It's much better to be dealing with an absolutely irredeemable hardline interlocutor, we should say. You're not actually talking to them. And you can say that's the real face, that's our real enemy, the implacable enemy that we have to defeat utterly.
So both Trump here and the hardliners there got their wish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They did. And there is this myth in town that the Iranian regime might be on its last legs. Let's not kid ourselves. There are major structural problems inside Iran. They're suffering from years of drought. There's major unrest, especially in the rural areas. This is a very unpopular regime. None of us would like to live in Iran. None of us would choose to live under this kind of autocratic regime. But it is also very resilient. It is also a stable government structure at the moment compared to everything else that's going on in the Middle East. And you hear, all you do is read the Iranian press or English translations of it, and you see Iranians protesting against their government, but they don't want to go so far as to destabilize the government. They don't want to overthrow the government because they don't want the chaos that they see going on in Syria. So there's this myth in this town that if we just knock hard enough, that somehow the Iranian regime's gonna crumble. And what I fear is exactly this, that the hardliners will come to power. You don't like the Iranian regime now, this could get a whole lot worse.
I think it's important at this stage to... Why
do you think Hamas won that election in Palestine? Like when the election came up, why do you believe that there weren't any peaceniks? Like it wasn't people, flower children, out there preaching, peace and love while Israelis were shooting people in the face. Hardliners take hold when things get bad, and people tend to go towards this idea of strength as opposed to this thing of weakness. Strength oftentimes is looked at, in many cases, for whatever reason, as being force. We're going to fight this particular oppression. We're going to fight this particular thing. You had something like that in the United States from the standpoint of Martin Luther King, but you also had Malcolm X, who was firmly within this camp of, we're going to fight back, I am a man, I'm going to do, etc. And you had thousands and millions of people who were backing X on this. There's an awesome conversation with James Baldwin, where James Baldwin makes this point of all of these African-American kids were, this particular systemic thing of the system itself pushing this level of inferiority of this particular thing, meaning in media, in the way that people were regarded, the way they were kept out of certain jobs, the way they were kept out of certain homes, the way the society itself looked at African Americans and the legal structure that sprung up in order to deal with that. He made this point that, and even to protect whites who were attacking African Americans in that system itself, meaning the whites would get off, and if blacks did anything, of course, they were going to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. James Baldwin has this awesome thing when he's making this point where he's having a conversation with Malcolm X. He's had these debates with X. And he said, look, all of these kids who were mistreated by the system, who were told that, called boy and looked at as less than a man. And you have this other person who says, yes, I am a man, and goddamn it, we're going to fight back. And yes, I want my freedom. I want my rights. I want the same opportunities that you have. I want this, and I want it now. If I have to wait for it for one more day, it's too late. I want it now. He says, of course, they're going to be receptive to it. They've been told their entire lives that they are boys and that they're not worthy and all this other stuff. And all of a sudden you have somebody else who's saying, yes, they are. He's doing it in his most aggressive, hyper-masculine way. Aggression wins out when people feel oppressed. They want somebody to fight for them, and they want somebody to be their advocate. So yeah, you tend to get more of the hard right, hawkish, let's say hawkish, but you tend to get more of people moving to the hard right in situations where they feel like they're under attack. Let's keep going. I agree with him. I guess my point is, yeah, I agree.
Maybe it goes without saying, but I think it's important that there are activities the Iranians are undertaking in the region that undercut U.S. interests. There's no question there that that's happening. And but the point is, how do you go about changing that? How do you go about addressing it? I think your op-ed today in The Guardian makes the case through dialogue. And with this deal, think about it. When I brought up the case of Mossadegh's overthrow, the democratically elected prime minister, when we overthrow him, that was 65 years ago. And there have been a lot of grievances in this relationship. And yet, 3 years ago, we reached this deal with the Iranians. It was a triumph of diplomacy. And yes, the relationship isn't perfect. It's far from it. But we should have used it as I think the Iranian foreign minister called it, we should use it not as the floor, but not as the ceiling, but as the floor. And we're doing the exact opposite. I think for the Trump administration, the idea of doing the work, the hard work of diplomacy, is so foreign to them that maybe it was too much to think about. But yet it's an opportunity. Here we are again, an enormous opportunity we've squandered to build on that deal and to make it something more lasting, to change the essence of the relationship in a meaningful way. And it was just discarded without a plan B, without any alternative. And I think that the administration has not offered anything in terms of where we go from here. And our European allies certainly are grappling with this now. They're faced with a region where they're adjacent to this region. They have the influx of refugees from all the conflicts. So this was an attack on our European allies' sovereignty, on their economic relationship with Iran, but also on their national security.
Yeah. American policy in the Middle East is in free fall.
Wait, it goes beyond that. It's not just their sovereignty. The United States is talking about putting sanctions on European business if those European businesses interact with Iran in this way. They're also talking about putting sanctions, meaning when you're hearing European allies, or quote unquote allies, whether you're talking about Germany or France or in England, make these statements that we hope the United States, our partner, don't attack our interests. Meaning, I hope they don't attack our business with these sanctions, but we're standing by Iran. Well, the United States has taken this disposition. If you stand by Iran, which all of the other European nations are, because they should stand by Iran, because Iran didn't break the goddamn agreement. If you're going to do that, we're going to put sanctions on your companies and your businesses. It goes further than what you're saying. It's not just this kind of ethereal thing. They are literally attacking the business interests in Europe. Let's keep going. But she's definitely right about those countries are on their borders, and those refugees who are flooding in into their borders. So this is somewhat direct to them. If there's any conflict or war in that part of the globe, the refugees, very well, just like Syria, will be flooding into Europe. Let's keep going.
We have no clear plan. We're losing friends, losing influence, losing allies. This could get very dangerous. I just
want to add, I'm not sure. I've heard people say there's no plan B, and I think from any sort of objective analytical standpoint, that seems correct.
Constructive plan.
It's the constructive, because I do think there are plan Bs, and we've already heard them. We've heard them in the media. Suddenly, we're back to the narrative of, well, if we push a little harder, the Iranian people will overthrow their government. They just need our help and support, which is a movie that we've seen before, not just on Iran. Let's take Gaza, for example. We've seen that exact movie before. History would argue that the U.S. has never had success at turning other people into tools of our foreign policy by making them so miserable. They say, let me take up the flag of your foreign policy.
We are consistent. We keep making the mistake over and over again, right?
Well, I don't want to pretend I'm in the heads of the people I disagree with. I think a lot of people believe this should be true. Yes. And if it turns out not to be true, at least we should have tried. And if it turns out not to be true and we're forced to go to war for the sake of humanity, we are. But that is sort of the plan B here. We will help and try to have them open.
Right there. She's right. I love this woman. I don't know who this woman is. But up to this point, everything that woman has said, I've agreed with. And I've said something, and then she said something behind me that was essentially agreeing with me. As I listened to the other person talk, I thought to myself, what are you talking about? They don't care. Like, in their minds, we have $1 trillion for the military. We can essentially dictate policy all throughout the world. That's what we're going to do. If a country doesn't want to do it, they can deal with whatever the consequences are in that situation. So in this case, if Europe doesn't necessarily want to go toe our plan with Iran, fine. We'll also put sanctions on their businesses. This is essentially a country or a government that has gone drunk with power, believing that it is still a unipolar power. It's not. I'm sorry. The world is not built that way. The fact that your European allies have abandoned you on this kind of gets that across. She's absolutely right. She's absolutely right. The plan B is, we're going to try to make you miserable. We're going to use internal forces, meaning we're going to use like something like the terrorists in Syria, where you're using these tiny terrorists. We're going to try to attack certain fault lines in the country itself. If that means we need to send in people to create riots and protests, then we will send in people to create riots and protests. We would do whatever we need to do to take that government down. What I would slightly disagree with her on is they destroyed Libya. They turned that into a basket case. They've been keeping Syria in war for God knows how long, allowing this kind of area where Israel can strike and Turkey can strike. No, it hasn't worked in the open where you're converting one government to another, but it has worked in essentially destroying those governments and creating chaos in that region of the world. I don't necessarily know if that's the objective, but again, I don't necessarily think these people are so empathetic that they care about this stuff. I don't think they care about the number of people they murder in these conflicts and stuff. I think they look at us as purely as geopolitical domination and geopolitical influence. These are chess pieces. They're not real human beings. They're just chess pieces. I want to do X around the globe. I want to get a particular resource around the globe. This is what I'm going to do. If war is one of the consequences, we have $1 trillion military for a reason. We have military in, 70% or 60% of the globe for a reason. Let's keep going back to her. I think she's right, though.
Overthrow themselves, and if forced, because don't forget, if Iran does go back to centrifuges spinning. We are back to the discussion of it being an existential threat. That was Bibi Netanyahu with that bomb. And when it's an existential threat to Israel, how many days is it till they go nuclear? Is it 10 days? Is it 100 days? It's constantly changing target. At that point, we have no choice but to act because it's an existential threat.
I want to get back to Saudi Arabia. NBS did a multi-million-dollar tour of the United States. He was in a lot of media, met with a lot of influential people. What is Saudi Arabia really, and what are its goals?
Well, I think, the Saudis are in the midst of a leadership transition. I think that, when you look at what President Obama tried to do to rebalance the U.S. in the Middle East by having a relationship with both the Iranians and the Saudis, maybe to some extent underestimated the insecurities of the Saudis during this pivotal period and underestimated how threatening they would see the fact that the U.S. is beginning a relationship with Iran. That's something we can debate. But when we think about the Saudis, they have this humanitarian disaster that they've created in Yemen, a war, by the way, that the United States has not spoken out against too harshly. And
I would say that's an understatement. Yes.
I'm putting it diplomatically. Then you have, if you look at every major crisis point in the Middle East, the solution to it somehow runs through Riyadh and Tehran. And if you also look at this undertaking that MBS, the Saudi prince, is trying to take for a major reform effort by the year 2030 in Saudi Arabia, it's very forward-looking if he can pull it off. It really makes you wonder, what are their priorities, and why aren't we encouraging that reform effort, telling them, find a solution in Yemen, stop that catastrophic war, get to the table with the Iranians, work that out, find a political settlement in Syria, strengthen this new government that's going to happen in Iraq. I mean, there are some serious issues that we should be encouraging the Saudis and Iranians now to come to the table and resolve, and we're doing the exact opposite.
The goal is domination. The goal is not to resolve an issue. If you have a lead in something, or if you and I are playing chess, and let's say it's chess, and I have a lead, let's say I have an extra knight, why on earth would I try to come to the table to have some kind of resolution? There would be no reason. I have an advantage. I'm going to press my advantage. I want to take that government down, so I'm going to try to take that government down. If you're talking about Syria, if I can't do that, then I can't do that. But at least I tried. But there's no point in coming to the table if you feel that you have some political advantage. You have the United States, Israel, all backing one similar agenda. You have a batshit crazy, rabid group of Republicans that are in office that are perfectly in line with whatever that agenda is. Meaning you have the United States military potentially on standby to be leveraged at the behest of an open-air ghetto, or the country that pushing an open-air ghetto, essentially an apartheid state, who's out there literally murdering people, murdering human beings, 52 of them, with open gunfire. I'm sorry. I'm being distracted because we have a storm and it's coming. And this other guy who's murdering and weaponizing illness or starvation. Let's keep going. I'm going to go for as far as I can go. We have a storm in the city of Virginia, so my broadcast may go down, but let's keep it moving until then.
Rob?
Yeah, so I'd say, and I've had an opportunity to discuss this with Mohammed bin Salman several times. I think from his perspective, to try to put myself in his shoes, he believes Saudi Arabia for too long has been a punching bag that Iran has been hitting, and that he believes Saudi Arabia is stronger militarily, diplomatically, has stronger allies. Why shouldn't Saudi Arabia fight back? Now, the problem with the fighting back is that everything that people say today is an indication of Iran expanding its reach in the region, has been the result of people going to war in the region. The Iraq War, obviously, number one. If it hadn't been for the Iraq War, Iran would not have the influence it has today in Iraq. The war in Lebanon, talk back in the 1980s. The war in Lebanon, Israel's invasion, that gave rise to Hezbollah. That gave Iran a hook in Lebanon. Yemen, we just heard about. A humanitarian disaster, the worst humanitarian disaster in the world today. What's increased Iran's influence? It's the coalition, Saudi-led coalition bombing of Yemen. The Houthis, the Shiite organization there, has become closer to Iran in reaction, and on and on and on. The same in Syria. War is what has expanded Iran's influence. And so, and I've said this to the Saudis, I've said, you may think that by pushing back Iran militarily, you're going to help yourself. You're simply going to empower Iran in a way that you're going to regret. So what I would criticize the Trump administration for, yes, they have much better relations with Saudi Arabia than we did under the Obama administration. Use that better relationship for sound policies, as Suzanne said. Put pressure on them to find a way out of Yemen. And by the way, I do want to thank you for your efforts on Yemen. I think we need more voices like yours to put the spotlight on that tragedy. Use it for that. Use it to push them to negotiate with Iran. Use it constructively. Use that better relationship you have with Saudi Arabia and with Israel, by the way, but to a purpose that serves U.S. interests, not enabling them to make the mistakes that they and we are going to pay for.
Lar, do you want to say a word about Israel and back it up a little bit? Israel today is not the political state that it was 20 years ago. It has undergone massive transformation. And, I asked Rob what the long-term goals of Saudi Arabia might be. What are the goals of the Netanyahu administration there? And what are the changes that have taken place in Israel over the last couple of decades?
So it's a timely question because it's something that I think we can understand and explain better in the United States now than we could have 2 years ago. In the sort of arc of illiberalism, Israel is significantly ahead of the United States, but it's on very much the same path. You have an Israeli government which is tending further and further right, not simply for cynical reasons of, politicking and appealing to certain voters. There are real ideological roots in this. And what we're seeing today is very much in power, a trend towards illiberalism, much like we're seeing here or in Eastern Europe or wherever else, which says we have ideals, we will implement them, might makes right, rule of the majority, not democracy. Little interest in the power of the civil society or even preserving civil society, things like human rights, a disdain for international law, international norms, to the extent that they in any way conflict with those goals. And what we're seeing today, and we had it on display in Jerusalem today. If anyone saw the visuals, the split screen of the celebrations in Jerusalem, the American officials, starting with Mr. Kushner and the president's daughter, celebrating, and a split screen showing tear gas and shooting on people inside Gaza. And I think it's important to emphasize, whether you want to argue that these are violent or non-violent, whatever, these are people who are inside Gaza. These are not people who've invaded Israel and are now threatening to take the town. This is shooting into Gaza. So you really have an alliance of illiberalism here. It isn't by mistake that Israeli policies are getting more and more energetic towards Iran, towards the Palestinians.
Aggressive might be another word.
Aggressive, or emboldened, let's say. This is an ideological strain. I think I think it's really important. When I said before, one man's catastrophe is another man's miracle, this is not happening, I think, by accident. And I think it's important to recognize the ideological roots of this if you're going to understand where it goes. These aren't just missteps all the way. These are deliberate steps. The Israeli government wants to keep the West Bank and Gaza forever. It wants every inch of Jerusalem. It's very clear about that. The American ambassador to Israel is absolutely in lockstep with that. And he's been on the record that way for years. Anyone who's surprised shouldn't be. And for folks who see the Trump administration as chaotic in their policymaking, I would encourage them to look at Israel-Palestine, and that reflects also on Iran, and note that the circle of people who have been the key advocates and the key advisors to the president on this issue are the same people who were his closest advisors before he became president. And they were the people who were his surrogates during the campaign. There's been remarkable coherence to their policy in the Middle East. And to the extent that we're talking about Saudi Arabia, I think it's a mistake to not focus on the Israel piece of that. because the idea that MBS is going to deliver the Palestinians or going to give cover for Israel on Israel-Palestine is a potent piece of the puzzle here. It is a potent piece. It has enormous resonance here in the United States. It has enormous resonance in Israel, where right now Israelis see the alliance with Saudi Arabia as far more important than resolving the conflict that is on their border, where 50-some people were killed today. And even if you believe that Israel is 100% justified and it's an act of self-defense, Israel killed 54 people on it's not even a border, the Gaza fence. That's not a situation that's going to be resolved by making backroom deals with Saudi Arabia. But that's where we are today. And it really, the trajectory of this is not encouraging, not because of missteps, but because we're headed very deliberately in a direction that is not encouraging.
All right, let's, while we're on Israel and Gaza, let's continue that discussion. I mean, it looks to me not only of the events of today, but just the actions of Israel over the last several years, plus the Trump administration repudiating the concept of a two-state solution, the growth of settlements, the kind of violence that we saw today. What is going to happen in the future when you have 2 million people in Gaza living in absolute desperation, 60% youth unemployment? What is going to be the future there? What do we see happening?
Let me start, but I have to admit my bias here, because I'm very pro-Israel. I have family in Israel. I have family in Jerusalem. I have a niece and a nephew who served in the IDF. I have a goddaughter who very recently was a sniper on the Gaza border. So I'm very concerned about their security, and I would never advocate a policy that would weaken the security of Israel. But what I fear is that the policies of this government in Israel are weakening the security of Israel, that Israel is becoming less and less secure by the Likud party's refusal to find a way to negotiate with the Palestinians, to end the occupation, to give some basic human rights to the people in that prison we call Gaza, that this is building up the frustration, the hopelessness to a point where it is going to explode. And today, I'm afraid, might have lit the fuse. This is the most Palestinians Israel has killed short of an outright war in a single day. This is more people than Palestinians that died during either one of the intifadas. This is an unprecedented situation, and in some ways, we're not paying enough attention to this because we're distracted by our own political circus at home. I mean, if we didn't have this kind of internal division at home, I think this would be the top story everybody was discussing. We'd have American diplomats flying to the area to try to calm it down, to try to find some way to restart the peace talks. Instead, we have this show.
This guy's muttering nonsense. I'm sorry, he's muttering nonsense. And what I mean by that is, Israel has done multiple incursions into Gaza, even during my lifetime. I think during the Obama administration, they killed over 2,000 people. I think it was like 2,200 people. 80% of those people were civilians. 80% civilians. Again, at that point, you're just murdering civilians. That's the same thing about the drone program. Crickets. Just crickets. Nothing took place. There were no consequences. At the end of the day, the United States always backs them in the UN. So why would they change? Explain to me. You have the United States backing you in whatever you do, meaning whatever you do, you get a pass from the UN. No other country has the balls to say or do anything about it, so it just rides. So whatever they do in that particular region of the world, regardless of how many people they murder and massacre, it doesn't matter. The New York Times will come up with a story, Palestinians killed. How did they get killed? Did they just magically die? No, they were shot by people like this guy's relative. I mean, the idea that this would be the top story and that people would be flying over there that's nonsense. That's nonsense. Barack Obama, before he left, he had this tepid resolution for the UN Security Council. Israel screamed like somebody had pinched their ass at a gay nightclub. Like, ah! Somebody has just grabbed my ass. No consequences. Doesn't matter what they do. No consequences. The ICC, criminal court, could say, hey, we're looking at you. It doesn't matter. No consequences. The very next week, they end up killing 54. There's no consequences. And they know there's not going to be consequences because anything that comes down the pike, the United States is going to ward off. It doesn't matter who's in office. There will be no consequences. Let's keep going. I'm sorry to interrupt him, but I found this to be nonsense.
In Jerusalem, that I just found out no Democrats were invited to this opening. This was a very selective audience here to celebrate this tragic turn in American policy. No American president, who are all strongly supportive of Israel, have ever thought we should move the embassy to Jerusalem because it wasn't our place to decide that issue.
What are you talking about? Multiple people have come up saying, Democrats and Republicans. Chuck Schumer is out there saying this was a good deal. This was a good day. This was a good day. Good job on moving it. There were multiple presidents that promised to move the embassy. I can't think of them off the top of my head, but I know there were multiple presidents that said they were going to move the embassy. There are multiple political leaders who thought it was a great idea for them to move the embassy. What are you talking about? Now, you can make the point that said those presidents were just promising it, we're never going to do it. Fair enough, but let's not pretend that this was purely a Republican thing and Donald Trump was the first to break the mold.
And the Israelis had to decide what the borders were. And by doing this, we're intervening in that internal struggle, putting our thumb on the scale on one side. And all this just makes the situation worse. But every single other person on this panel is more expert. I'm just talking.
Let me just ask anyone to jump in. Talk a little bit about what is going on in Gaza right now. What's going on?
Sure, I'll try to take that one. I have not been in Gaza in a couple of years. What is going on in Gaza right now are a number of factors are coalescing. It come to a head. Part of it is Jerusalem. Jerusalem lit the fuse this time. The first fuse, Joe referred to a second fuse. The announcement in December, which really, I mean, let's remember, Gazans can't get to Jerusalem. It's been years since Gazans have been able...
Explain that. Take it. You know this stuff upside, downside. Many people do not. What do you mean by they can't go?
So Palestinians who live in Gaza have restricted travel. To get from Gaza to Jerusalem, you have to cross through Israel. Israel does not let Gazans leave Gaza, except under very, very limited circumstances through a long permit process, which is arduous and generally, it's very, very difficult to travel. So most Gazans, if the average, I don't know what the percentage is, it's under 30, it's very high. A huge percentage of those people have never been to Jerusalem, have never been to the West Bank. They basically have only ever been to Gaza, or maybe they've gotten out through Egypt. It is a place that has been under blockade for a decade now. And this is one of the most densely populated places in the world. It is run by Hamas, which is a terrorist organization. It happens to have been democratically elected some years back. That was rejected by the world. Like Joe said, it's probably in the same sense as Iran. It's not probably a place you'd want to live. I would not want to live under a Hamas government. But living there is now for years, people in Gaza have had their lives subjected to all sorts of misery on the argument that this is the way to eject Hamas from Gaza. And it hasn't worked. What it means is today you have this densely populated place with a very, very high youth population, extraordinarily high unemployment, extraordinarily high poverty, dependent on outside aid. And you essentially, with the Jerusalem decision, said, by the way, there is zero political horizon for ending the conflict, and only an end to the conflict can actually resolve the situation you're in. Everything else is just giving you, bandages and some aspirin. That's what the Jerusalem decision was. But what we're seeing on the Gaza fence, and you can't call it a border because it's not a border, what you're seeing on the fence is all of the pressures that have built up over the years coming to a head with this decision. And then you've got Hamas trying to ride these pressures, and where they can direct them so that they can claim legitimacy. Because when the grassroots rises up and says we will not have it anymore, that's also a repudiation of the people in charge. And that's intolerable for Hamas because Hamas needs to be in charge. So you have people fighting for who's controlling it, which gives Israel a sometimes legitimate, sometimes not legitimate excuse to say, this is all terrorism, this is an act of war, and under the laws of war, we have the right to use lethal force against unarmed people who are near the fence, which if they were to damage that fence and breach it, they could come into Israel and would be a threat to us. And I don't see, honestly, it dying. I suspect that we will see this period of intense demonstrations die down. A combination of fatigue, a combination of outside efforts to throw in more bandages and more aspirin, which I have to say it would be immoral at this moment to oppose food, bandages, aspirin, whatever it takes, because the humanitarian situation there is genuinely turning catastrophic. But we have to remember this is not an earthquake zone. This is an entirely man-made catastrophe. And the solution to it is not humanitarian aid. The solution to this is a political solution. And right now, going back to where we started, we are heading in the opposite direction from a political solution.
Rob, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I'd say, it's customary to say that the Arab world and the world is forgetting the Palestinians. I'll tell you some people who haven't forgotten the Palestinians, and that's the Palestinians. And they're the ones who are living in the situation that Laura described in Gaza, and also living in deplorable conditions in the West Bank where there is no political horizon. Now, the cost it's a human cost, no doubt about it, and it's a powder keg, and at some point it may explode. It may be today, it may be in a month, it may be in a year, but at some point, if people have no hope and they're living in these conditions, they have nothing to lose. But there's another cost to all this, which is really, and I was visiting the occupied territories a few months ago, and anyone who does, it's very hard to look at that and think that a two-state solution is still possible today, because of everything that's been happening in terms of the settlements and the roads and just the conditions on the ground. So then what? I mean, if you've killed the two-state solution, you've killed that paradigm, you've basically neutered all of the political leaders in Palestine among the Palestinians who were foot soldiers for that cause. What are you left with? Maybe a call for one-state solution, civil rights, equal rights for all. Are Israeli Jews going to accept that? So you may be setting up a perpetual conflict, which today we are enabling. Again, it goes back to the point we've all made. The U.S. can't solve this just because it wants.
I mean, look, part of this whole thing of, I look at this stuff from the standpoint of this kind of gamesmanship stuff. If you're looking purely from the standpoint of domination, not fairness, you're not trying to come with a compromise, you're not trying to do anything. The only compromise you want is you lose, I win. If you look at it from that standpoint, what Israel is doing makes sense. We want complete domination of this region, and we want to take this territory. Hey, United States, you stole your territory from Native Americans. How are you going to bitch at us for stealing the territory from the Arabs, the Palestinians? He's right. The two-state solution thing gets dusted. You pretend as if you're in negotiations, and while you're pretending to be in negotiations, you continue to take land, knowing that the United States will always back you up within the UN Council. Meaning you can take the land in perpetuity until you get to the point where you've just taken all of the land. Or you get to the point where the two-state solution becomes just nonsense because of the amount of land that you've stolen. And again, knowing that the United States is going to back you up in the UN while pretending to have this kind of dialogue, knowing that the United States, who's supposedly partnering in this dialogue, is your complete ally and has assisted you in billions of dollars. The whole point is domination. They're not looking for a strategy or some way to come together.
But to enable policies that are moving us away from a two-state settlement and that are moving us towards a potential conflict between a desperate population that has no hope and the Israeli government, that's diplomatic malpractice.
I would just add, going back again to this being a feature, not a bug, there have been Israeli people on the Israeli right and that people on the American side who support the Israeli right who have been arguing for years. There is no solution. I mean, this is not the idea that no solution is a failure. There are many people who would argue there's never been a solution. The answer is for the U.S. to get behind Israel, let Israel do what it needs to do, let it define what it needs to do and what it wants to do. We get behind it and recognize the Palestinian that's just going to remain an unsolved issue.
Right.
That is actually a position that is advocated in our world.
So that's a group of 2 million people living in misery in Gaza.
I love that woman. She's awesome.
In the indefinite future. Is that what you?
Well, it's more than that because that includes the West Bank. The no solution refers to East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. So it's many more than that.
Yeah. Let me kind of end the discussion here. It's been a fairly pessimistic discussion, if I may say so.
Yes.
Because it's a pessimistic situation, and we're trying to look at it honestly. What would, well, I won't ask what the administration should do, because we know what they are doing, which is unprecedented. I mean, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think historically, administrations have always given at least lip service to trying to bring people together in the Mideast, right?
Yeah.
I mean, whether they did it or not, at least they made the effort that we got to sit down and work it out, and peace is our goal, and in an unprecedented way, that is not really what Trump is saying. What should, one of the areas, and Rob mentioned this in terms of Yemen, where I think there is a growing understanding that in the Congress, the Constitution is very clear, that it is the U.S. Congress and not the president who has war-making powers. And we all know that Congress has abdicated that on the Democratic and Republican leadership for a very long time. And some of us are trying to get it back and trying to get the Congress more involved on issues like the issues we have discussed here tonight. So I'm not going to ask you what the Trump administration should do, because we know what they are doing. What should those of us in Congress who believe that we should have an even-handed policy in the Middle East, in terms of Israel and Palestine as well, in terms of Saudi Arabia and Iran, what would make sense to you to see for those of us to be doing?
Well, in terms of Yemen, I think it's important to remember that the Iranians and the EU4, the French, UK, Germans, and Italians have now had, I think, 2 rounds of discussions on Yemen. And I suppose now that the United States this is through part of the JCPOA process, I don't know if the U.S. will even be part of this now. Let's face it, the Trump administration, with this move on the JCPOA, has abdicated U.S. leadership on a whole host of issues. It's not just the JCPOA. And I think we have to face reality. We can't really look to this administration for leadership on these crises, these issues of top national security importance to us. But what we can do now is, I just came from Europe last night, where I met with Europeans and Iranians. And what the Europeans are saying is they see this as a direct attack on their sovereignty. They're going to look for ways to continue to keep the deal alive, look for ways to maybe do blocking sanctions against the U.S., other ways of licenses so European businesses can continue to do business with Iran. And the Iranians, for their part, I think they're going to show a fair amount of restraint in the aftermath of this disastrous decision. I think they're going to continue to abide by the Iran deal. They're not going to restart the centrifuges. They're not going to kick out the inspectors. I think they're going to try to work with the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese to make this deal work, and work on the other issues you just mentioned. But again, the U.S. is absent. This is not America first. This is America alone. And I think the only way we're going to solve this problem is by electing a new president, a new Congress in November. I don't see any other solution, Senator.
Let me start. There's several things that the U.S. Congress can do now. And part of that builds off what Suzanne just said. We have to try to work with the Europeans to keep the deal alive. So if what we're worried about is the deal completely falling apart, remember, this is like the Paris Climate Accord. Just because the U.S. withdraws doesn't mean the accord is dead. No, the deal is still alive for now. And the Europeans and the Russians and Chinese are working, as Suzanne said, with the Iranians to try to keep them in. So what do they need? In order to do that, the Europeans need to be able to do business with Iran. But the administration's about to move to put sanctions on European companies. Remember, we don't do business with Iran. We don't sell, so you can't sanction our own companies. You got to sanction the other companies that are doing this. You got to start sanctioning the people who will buy or buying oil from Iran. Who's that? That's China, number 1, European Union, number 2, and Japan, number 3.
And India.
And India. So you got to start sanctioning those people. Well, that is idiotic. So we already have this rift developing between Europe and the United States. We are weakening the Western alliance with this. Middle East, all those problems aside, we also have this other huge problem that this policy is creating. So I believe the Senate, the Congress has to step in and try to prevent the administration from imposing new sanctions on European companies. That's the number one thing I would do. The number two thing I would do is try to take another run on Yemen. You came real close. 44 senators voted for that resolution. If you could get a pause in the Yemen war, if you could stop the U.S. from aiding that slaughter, that would be a huge confidence build. That would be a huge humanitarian and peace building and stability building step in the Middle East. And you can do that without the administration.
I agree with you there. Let me deal with the secondary boycott issue. I mean, isn't this rather extraordinary that we are now putting sanctions on our major international allies? Is this of some unprecedented?
We've tried to do it before. It's not had much success, and I think, as Joe said, that's not a road we want to be on if we want to build a coalition to get anything done.
Yeah.
But you said, and this is a pretty pessimistic panel. I want to apologize for people listening if it was, but I want to end on an optimistic note. I think the reason for optimism is the fact that you're holding a discussion like this, that people are listening, that many, many, many thousands are listening outside and following this. I think what can be done, and building on this, is having a more honest conversation with the American people, having a more honest conversation coming from members of Congress on issues like, what are we doing between Israelis and Palestinians? What are we doing with Iran? What are we doing with Saudi Arabia? What are we doing on the war in Yemen? What are we doing? Another issue that you've written about and the past or spoken about, what about a counterterrorism policy? Is it really the smart policy? We need to have a debate about that. We need to have a debate about war powers. And that's where hope comes from. It's from bringing Americans, engaging them, convincing them that this is not foreign. This is very much domestic. Because as you put it, this is where we put our resources. This is how we send our men and women to war. So foreign policy is domestic policy, is public policy.
Let me just conclude by saying that I think the overwhelming majority of the American people believe that the function of the United States in global politics is to do everything that we can to prevent war and the incredible, what really bothers me, and I speak as the former chair of the Veterans Committee, how easy it is for people to give these great speeches about war and bombing and all that stuff. And then you meet with the families and the young men and women who come home from these wars and the kind of terrible suffering we have seen in our own country as a result of Iraq and Afghanistan, not to mention, the 500,000 dead in Iraq and the massive displacement of people, all of the suffering that exists. And I say, sometimes we don't see that. Sometimes we don't see that as a people. But I do believe that in our heart of hearts as a people, the American people do want to see their government play a constructive role around the world, understanding how difficult it is, but bring people together. Get them to sit down. Get them to put away the guns and the planes and the tanks. And it is a sad thing that at this moment we're doing the exact opposite. But I agree with you. I mean, this may have been pessimistic in the sense that we're talking about reality. But I don't think that is where the American people want us to be. And especially when we talk about a world, think about it, a world now. We got children all over the world living, dying unnecessarily because their parents don't have a few cents to buy a medicine to cure an easily treated disease. You got people living on $1 a day, $2 a day, and the world is spending, well over $1 trillion a year on weapons of destruction. Our role should be the role of bringing people together, striving for world peace, as hard as that may be. And I am not pessimistic that is where the American people are. So let me just conclude by thanking our panelists, thanking all of you for being here this evening, and thanking those who are watching us live stream. Thank you all very much.
Very cool. That was very cool. That woman is awesome. It's like everything or a lot of stuff she said out of her mouth, I was like, yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that. Look, I want to say something about what Sanders said. Saying that he doesn't believe that the American people are in a place where they're okay with these wars. That they believe that America is doing its best when they're talking about around the world. that we're essentially a good actor. We're trying to prevent wars. We're trying to bring people together. We're trying to hug, kumbaya, and all this good stuff. Well, here's the problem with that. The media itself tells people that that's what we are doing. Like, it's like, yes, the American population thinks that because the media propagates that myth all the time. If you're looking at CNN, MSNBC, all these news, Fox News, we're doing great things around the world. The perspective of the media is that the United States is doing good, regardless of what the United States is doing. It may mess up, it may fuck up, it may have, problems sometimes in the way it goes about its affairs, but we're a superpower. And we're a good superpower. Not like those other sniveling bitches superpower. We're the good superpower. And we're trying to do the right thing around the world. That's the perspective of media. Like, it's difficult to get the perspective through people's heads that, look, your government is doing bad things and your military is doing bad things around the globe when their entire media apparatus, at least the main one, is telling them something else. So I agree with Sanders that, yes, the American people would be there. I don't necessarily agree with him. I got to be honest, I can't even say I even agree with that per se. Look, I don't think people in general want all of these wars. I don't think people in general want their money spent on all of these wars. None of that at all. I think the reason why you have to scare the shit out of people to this degree is to get them to support the stuff. I think left to their own devices, all things being equal, no. Meaning, I agree with Sanders that all things being equal, yes, people would be in that spot. But they need to be jarred from that illusion. And the mainstream media is not about jarring from that illusion. It's about keeping that illusion persistent. So, and there was something else. Coalition. He said that's not the way you build coalitions. Trump has his coalition. He has Saudi Arabia and Israel. I mean, and for the most part, foreign politics is subordinate to internal politics. Donald Trump is more worried about his internal politics, and I think, than the foreign affairs stuff. We have $1 trillion for the military. He believes that America can do what America wants to do, and all these other countries essentially have to conform to us. That's his political idea. He doesn't believe that there are any strings attached to us in this way, so he can do whatever he wants. This idea of political dominance. He has a coalition in the Middle East. It's called Saudi Arabia and Israel. And both of those powers want to stamp out the regional power of Iran. This is about domination. That's all this is about. He's believing Europe is going to have to conform. So it's kind of like the same way the Democratic Party just kind of assumes that lefties are going to have to conform because they have nowhere else to go. Trump is effectively telling Europe, you have nowhere else to go. Bend the knee. I think he's going to find that they do have somewhere else to go. So let's see who's here. As much as I agree with any reformer, I should say, let's see, Finkelstein doesn't describe Hamas as terrorists. Yeah, Finkelstein is massively interesting. I've listened to several of his lectures, and I've seen several of his interviews. I've even seen 1 or 2 of his debates. He is ferocious. That guy is ferocious. He's awesome. He is absolutely awesome. Let's see, Balthazar. Not many super pacifist religions. Super pacifist religions. Jay's gone through 3 Ivanka posters this week. They're soaked and begin to attract flies. That's hilarious. Holy cannabis oil. Bernie needs to abandon the DNC before they do it to him again. Yeah, because you know he's going to run in 2020. At least I think he is. Terry Robinson. Here Bernie goes with his bread and butter. We need free stuff. It's not free. There's no such thing as free. You, as a society, can come to some terms on what you want to do as a society. In fact, what he was talking about had nothing to do with any kind of socialistic ideas. It had to do with just being a good fucking person. Hey, maybe we should murder people across the globe. Maybe our previous murdering across the globe didn't necessarily bring about the best results to us. That's something different than free stuff. I don't know if you're watching the same speech. Lorms. But religion are made by man, yes. Merely blueprints for the societies they insist on living within. Nice, we're having a religious argument. You don't vote because someone has a chance. You vote for them because they align with your moral compass. Holy cannabis oil. That is fascinating. And holy cannabis oil, that's what I've said myself. Like this idea of voting because, the lesser evil. Oh, I'm terrified of that guy, so I'm voting for this guy. I understand why people would do it, because they would say, I'm willing to settle for XYZ. But we have a two-party system. If you're doing that, that means you're persistently stuck with whoever the candidate puts up or comes up in that party. Meaning the moment that you have a power center in that party that wants to persist their point of view, they just need to make him more attractive than the other person, or they need to scare the shit out of you about the other person. They've come up with a gimmick, this kind of Chinese finger trap, in order to get people to consistently vote for shitty candidates, using their own, ideas of, well, this person is at least worse, to get them to vote for him. This is a political trick. The only way to break that political trick is to stop engaging in that political trick. I agree with you, Holy Cannabis Oil. You vote for the person who represents your interests, not anybody else. Otherwise, you allow that trick to persist itself, and that trick has persisted itself for 20 years. Let's see. Always follow your own moral compass. Jill Stein got a lot more votes than she was credited for. Sterling Price. Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. Look, I think we have problems with our voting system. Hands down. I've been the first person to say so. And because we have problems with the voting system, it's hard to know really what the result is. I mean, we don't even necessarily let candidates go in to interrogate the vote itself. It's one thing if you had a system where there was a focus on election integrity itself, but election integrity is like the last thing, or the last part of the system that anybody pays attention to. I'm not necessarily sure if this is there purely for the fudge factor, meaning these guys, just look at fudge factor as part of the battlefield. I don't know. As the public itself, it should not be something that's accepted. We should know who we're electing in those offices. How many votes did Jill Stein get? I have no idea. The Green Party has issues. I'll say it that way. The Green Party has definitely issues. Garden Gnome, way out of the trap. Write in a hog rather than vote for the party. Garden, yes. That's my point, man. The solidarity of no. It's like Hillary Clinton cheated me, but I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton. It goes beyond just that vote. They're fundamentally breaking the democratic system or the representative government system. Can't allow that to take place. If you're willing to give that stuff up over fear, deserve to lose it. Jamal, good video with Canova about destroyed ballots. Sterling Price, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Holy Cannabis Oil, Sterling Price correct. Fractional voting kept her numbers down. Beltazar 228. At the very least, we need to stop arming Israel. Yeah. And we need to stop giving Saudi Arabia all those weapons also. Yeah. Agreed. Agreed. Momi Muki. Is Hillary still planning to run in 2020? Oh, God, I fucking hope not. God, I fucking hope not. Terry Robinson, Nakba. I was referring as a general statement. We have been in a holding pattern for decades. It was not good before this move. Yeah, they're acting as if Donald Trump is alone on this. You do have other Democrats who are on board for this. Like I said, Chuck Schumer is on board for this. You've had presidents to promise this. They didn't necessarily follow through, for fair enough, but they did promise this. Donald Trump is just the one who promised it and actually delivered it. Yeah, the catastrophe. Tabitha Enriquez, Jill only got 1 million more votes than 2012, even though 15 million left the Democratic Party. BS. Tabitha Enriquez, that's a good point. But how do you know those Democrats didn't leave after the election? Like, Hillary lost. They're demoralized. They're embarrassed and ashamed of themselves for voting for this woman, and then this woman still lost, and they say, I'm done. I don't want to, I'm done. Because I guess my point in this, the moment that Donald Trump gets elected, this idea of the monster, well, you already have the worst case scenario. It's like, what are you saying? What is the Democratic Party going to protect you from at that point? They've failed to a maniac. And so, in that case, would you be more inclined to say, I'm done? Everything that took place in 2016, this guy won. The worst case scenario is here. I call quits. Like, I guess what I'm saying is, how do we know that that's not before the election? That's all. Daddy Nap. Biden is doomed if he runs. What they don't know in 2016 was us playing nice. Never again. Oh, never again. Never again. I love that. That's like a pun. Abby Martin should have been on that panel. Balthazar 228. That woman would have been spitting fire. Abby Martin would have been spitting fire. It never reminds me. I need to re-email. Thomas Sermon. The Dems are going to push Biden down our throats. I think you're right, by the way. I think Joe Biden is going to run because they're trying to go with this thing of they're trying to get this stench of corporate America off of them. So they're like, who can we run to get the stench of corporate America? Let's try Kamala Harris. Let's try Joe Biden. Meaning, let's go for the everyman, go get him Joe, or the African American Kamala Harris. It's like they're going to try a two-pronged approach. This person seems to be a little bit more lefty, or the Joe Biden. It's like, take your pick. This idea of trying to hedge off Sanders. Part of the reason that they're not taking quote-unquote corporate PAC money is to try to hedge off Sanders. They're trying to get the optics of, see, we're not bought. We're not bought. But again, all of this is optics. The reality is the corporate PAC money is a small percentage of what they have. And if you can get rid of a small percentage of your cash in order to get a better footing, well, the point is to get elected. A small percentage of the cash is a lesser factor in that, if that makes sense. If I need to get elected and I need to show that I have some kind of lefty gravitas or bravados or lefty, what's the word I'm looking for? Bona fides. Well, this is one of the things that I'm going to use to do that. Now, you may trick some people who says, oh, see, that guy's not bought. That guy's not bought. That guy got rid of corporate PAC money. Not necessarily knowing or not necessarily watching this show, realizing that corporate PAC money is just a small part of the campaign's amounts. So, Biden has credit card stench all over him. And by the way, Biden was one of those third-way Democrats that enacted this workable point of view that's in the Democratic Party today. So, Biden is one of those corporatist hacks, just like the other ones. I'm gathering hits on Biden from C-SPAN. He went right of H.W. Bush on crime and drugs. He said Vietnam was a good plan on 89. He pushed permanent occupation all over the globe. Neoliberal godfather. Yes, that's my point. Like I said, he was one of those third ways. Biden is a pedophile. I don't know if that's true. I know what you're talking about. There's a video where Biden looks like he's perving on this other woman. That the woman looks like a kid. So yeah. If there was only political inaction committees where large amounts of money was raised for no political impact, wait, that's literally the DNC. That's literally the DNC. Wow. And Balthazar, you're right, by the way. Or actually, Balthazar, you're kind of wrong. They're massively in debt. They're so weak and feckless that they can't get any money. Who on earth, what plutocrat wants to drop money into an organization that's lost 1,100 seats all throughout the United States, the House, Senate, Supreme Court, and presidency? You could throw your money in the dumpster anywhere. Why throw it in the DNC? Not to mention, you have these other campaign arms that have sprung up, like Obama, kept his campaign thing going. It's been rivaling and pulling other plutocrats from the DNC. It's like all of them are fighting for this same well of corporate super, plutocrat money. It's like, I'm going to get the money. I'm going to get the money. I need to get the money. All of them diving for the same dollars. Yeah. Let's keep going. I'm just saying. I agree with you. That place is a dumpster fire. You can throw your money away anywhere. Lindsey Graham is a pedo. How else do you explain him being an effeminate warmonger but blackmail? What? Burnman 23. Jesus Christ. Everybody's a pedo. You guys think everybody's a pedophile. Lori Glenna. Didn't the DNC ask Hillary for that list money back? I don't know. That's a good question. She was. That was the funny other part. They kept saying Bernie Sanders is not helping Hillary Clinton. Obama gave the DNC the list. Hillary Clinton was like, I'll rent you this list. I'll rent you this list. That woman was still getting money. But Jamal, if we allow progressives and general races, our donors will get angry and we won't be able to afford Hillary Clinton's priceless list. Rising Democratic star Nancy Pelosi. That's awesome. Pete D, honestly, I think they'd lose even more money if they started to support progressives, but the Democrats would gain credibility and trust. Pete D, right there. Here's the thing. The Democratic Party was never really about cash. Like, look, you need money to run, yes, but it wasn't, and I can't say never. At one point, yes, of course, the polarity of the party changes, but the FDR Democrats, the New Deal Democrats, they were getting beat from the standpoint of money. What they were winning was the standpoint of power, meaning labor power. The Democrats have allowed their main strong point to be decimated and abused purely because plutocrats were allowed into the party itself. How can you be all that vocal for the advocate for ideas of workers and laborers and unions if you have this plutocrat who's harmed by that, and if you say shit like that, he's not going to put dollars in your G-string? The Democratic Party taking on these New Deal guys. Third Way. This was the death nail from the standpoint of progressives or lefties in the party. At that point, you became subordinate to essentially the party apparatus itself. Essentially, the party continuously telling them, just be lucky we're not Republicans. We're at least worse. Be happy with our radical incrementalism. Yeah, I agree, man. Let's see. Rising star Nancy Pelosi. That's hilarious. Oh, I know what I was saying. Credibility and trust. Yeah, it was never about the money. The Democratic Party, the strength of the Democratic Party was not about the money. You guys got lazy and you decided that it was an easy route to get money in that way. It's labor power. It's manpower. It's this idea that the public itself trusts, the majority of the public itself will be on your behalf with this idea of these guys are being earnest. Instead, you've lost labor in a large part. There were a large number of people in labor, more than many times, I think, definitely before the last election, that left the Democratic Party and went over to Donald Trump because they believed him more than they believed the Democratic Party. That is a breathtaking failure. That is a breathtaking failure. When somebody says the Pentagon lost track of $21 trillion, and that number boggles the mind in trying to comprehend that, it is dwarfed by the level of failure that is the Democratic Party in this regard. Let's keep going. Jimmy Carter was the last Democratic president who was reasonable, Mookie. And just think, today he's considered to be this flaming lefty. And Obama would barely talk to him because he didn't like the image. He didn't like the optics. It's amazing. All right, I'm not going to keep this going too long. I have an interview coming up with Cynthia McKinney at 9:30 p.m. That should be extremely interesting. I have a host of questions that I want to ask her that I've been chomping at the bit to ask any political person that's been in office, especially from the standpoint of the federal level. So this is going to be a fascinating conversation. 9:30. Hopefully I'll see you guys there. Thanks, guys. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe, and of course, you can always support the Patreon. Thanks, guys. And we are